Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And with me, as always, well, I guess not as always, it's been about 2 months since we've been together. But my general host, co-host, Derek Cohen, who's our Chief Officer of Research. Derek, we always like to do something fun right at the top, a little hot take, for the people, just to get them ready to go for the podcast. ACL Fest was a nationally known music festival, probably one of the biggest in the country these days. It's 2 weeks away here in Austin. So the question to you is, I'm an old guy, you're an old guy. At what age are you too old to go to an outdoor all-day festival like ACL? Is it 25, 35, never?
See, I'm going to go for never. See, when I turned 40, I went to the ironically named, given the way framing of this topic, When We Were Young festival in Las Vegas, which was basically if you frozen in amber the 2006 lineup for the Vans Warped Tour, and then put them on stage. Even though they did have some pretty innovative spacing and timing, so they actually got a lot of bands in playing at a pretty short time. Now, I would say that you're never too old to attend, but you're definitely rolling the dice where, instead of being sponsored by Vans, this should be probably sponsored by like Advil or maybe some sort of Tempur-Pedic or orthopedic shoes. I think you should.
I think there should be some. We're a research organization. There should be some metric that tells you whether or not you should go. Like you should know at least 75% of the bands and be able to name a song or something in order to go.
Yeah, that unfortunately would not disqualify me, but that also shows that when you have these targeted events, we're not talking about ACL or this particular instance. We're not talking about ACL where you see 90 people you've never heard of, then buried down in a small print. You see Grand Funk Railroad,
Wilco.
Yeah,
you're like, yes, I know that one.
Yeah,
what's Weezer doing these days?
Yeah. But then you look towards the top, you're like, what is a Doja Cat? It makes no sense.
The other thing about ACL that I've noticed about being in Austin is, 48 weeks out of the year, there's just homeless people everywhere on the corners, but around the week before ACL and the week before South by Southwest, you're starting to notice that the homeless people apparently somehow go somewhere or disappear or whatever. And just being really cynical. I mean, obviously they're doing that on purpose to clean up the streets, getting ready for the people, who are coming into town for those festivals and being hey, look how wonderful our city is, Well,
allow me to yes and that catastrophe, because not only do you have that selective enforcement when that happens, it also coincides, specifically ACL and South by, with what tend to be the two nicest weeks of the year. And so everyone goes, oh, I could definitely live here.
Oh, no.
It's like, if you can't take Austin in August, you don't deserve Austin in, these 4 weeks.
Yes, that's right. August is what we pay for the rest of the year.
Yes.
All right. Well, enough of that. Let's get to exactly why we're here. We are thrilled to have our guest, Brad Wilcox. We'll get to his book in just a minute, but Brad Wilcox is a professor of sociology and the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, my father's alma mater. We discussed that, so thank you for that. He's the Future Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He is the author of this fabulous book that I just read. It's called Get Married, which I did prior to the book, but I did get married. Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. You can get that on Amazon. It was out earlier this year. So I'll just jump right in, Brad, to the book. You published it in February, and we're all about outcomes and results here. So have marriages improved since you published your book?
I'm sure immeasurably, Brian.
That's awesome. Well, let's get into it, because this is one of the things that I think maybe it's one of those issues, I don't know, it doesn't capture during the campaign season and all of that, and it really is one of the things that sort of emanates from think tanks and other organizations like ours and yours. Right. But this is a fantastic book. I think everybody should read it. But let's start at the beginning. Kind of what's the problem? What are you noticing about marriage in general and kind of what the issue is?
Yeah, so I was raised by a single mom, and I kind of got into this business in terms of family sociology because I was thinking about the importance of marriage for kids, and we've got a lot of research on the importance of marriage for children. But as I've been talking to students at the University of Virginia, where your dad went, I'm getting kind of this sense from a lot of students, particularly from women, that they're kind of worried about their prospects for dating and for marriage down the road. And I've been also kind of getting from the media and from other outlets kind of just a sense too that there are a lot of young adults, particularly women again, who are kind of like worried about their prospects for dating and for marriage. And so this kind of got me thinking about the importance of marriage, not just for kids, but also for adults. And so this new book, Get Married, is focused more on kind of making the case, for marriage to young adults in terms of this is like an important institution that's worthy of your time and attention and focus. But then also kind of giving, folks who are already married, like yourselves, some hints about how to forge a strong and stable marriage, both to kind of, do well in your own families, but also to kind of give, I think, a good model, a good example to young adults who are coming up.
Yeah, that's one of the fun things. It's not just, a book about the research, which the first kind of third or half of it is, but then there's also like some good, research-based almost marriage advice kind of towards the end.
Yep.
But I want to talk about that first part. I mean, where do you see, the origin of the decline, right? Like we always know the statistics. I mean, in Texas, we're about to put out a report that you helped out with, of course, and one of the co-authors in. But in Texas, we've seen a 45% decline in the marriage rate since 1990. That is a staggering statistic, especially for a place like Texas, where we do have these sort of family values, and people look to Texas as a beacon for that. But we've had a 45% degree. What do you sort of pinpoint as the origin of that?
So I think this is one of those, classic trends that's kind of over-determined. And I think kind of on the economic front, we're seeing a lot of guys who are not college educated kind of floundering in today's labor market. And that's a big deal because still, even today, women are looking for guys who are, financially reasonably successful when it comes to getting married and staying married. I think we've seen our culture move in a more secular direction too, which obviously has real impacts on marriage as well. Since, as you know, the late 1960s, a lot of our public policies have unintentionally penalized marriage. It used to be among the poor, naturally among the working class, and so that's kind of a problem that's playing out as well. And then I do kind of talk about what's called kind of by me the Midas mindset. That is sort of, I would say, more salient for middle and upper class young adults, which is kind of like this idea that the thing that matters is work, is career. But that's kind of like the whole purpose of life, really, or the primary purpose of life. And kind of discounting the importance of love and marriage and starting a family in terms of what they're focusing on. And so it just kind of means that they're spending a lot of their time in their 20s and even early 30s on just, on the career and kind of not really paying attention to the importance of finding someone who'd be a good boyfriend, a good girlfriend. And then a good spouse and parent as well.
Derek had mentioned our paper that's actually literally being published today and coming out. We've got a great event today with Brad talking about the launch of that paper. Was there anything in the paper and the research that we've done on this issue that you think would be particularly interesting to highlight about stuff that we found about the decline of marriage, or maybe the reasons for it, and maybe what we can do about it?
Well, I think it's I would not say that there's anything. I would say that it's all interesting, but I would say there's nothing really surprising in there. If you take what this paper can be summed up as an assemblage of policies in different domains, different spheres of the public policy arguments that essentially redound to stronger marriages, stronger families. And, people don't think that, our agenda on voc ed or post high school vocational training is a marriage problem. But just as Brad illustrated, there is almost a one-to-one quarrel about the marriageability of a particular individual and their ability to attain basically the means and the abilities by which to support a family. And so I think that by framing it as, we frame it obviously as a pro-family agenda, but these are things that if, you've been following the Texas Public Policies Foundation, AEI, for, any number of years, there's not going to be some, where'd that one come from? We're talking, school choice, tax credits, smoothing out marriage penalties and cliffs. And, again, basically focusing on that success sequence that has been shown time and again to essentially eradicate poverty by those who actually adhere to it.
And Brad has some of his own policy recommendations in the book that we'll get to a little bit later. But I did want to, one of the things I did, I'm talking about the origins of kind of the decline of marriage and all of that. One of the things I sort of expected, just because it's kind of hot to talk about right now, that I didn't see in the book, or maybe it is in there in some form. But kind of what others are kind of saying is sort of the darker side of what's destroying marriage. And I mean, you can go back to even the early 70s and the Marxists and all that. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir has the famous quote, "The family must be abolished," with absolute measure. And this is in the early 70s.
Sure.
They started, the Marxists started this project of trying to, replace marriage and replace fathers with government and so on and so forth. Is that element still, I mean, James Lindsay and others have talked about this, but do you, in your research, is that element still out there? And did you make a conscious choice not necessarily to put those gloomy kind of things in your book, or what? How do you approach that?
No, I mean, I think there's certainly kind of critical voices from the late 60s and 70s that are kind of, launching one kind of assault or another on marriage and family back then, and then there are kind of newer voices in our day, who are doing that as well. I think in the culture they're not as central. But I do think, again, there's kind of like this pervasive individualism and careerism that we do see articulated both in today from the left and parts of the right. And so I talk in the book about, for instance, Andrew Tate now on the right is kind of saying that marriage is a bad deal for men. They should just focus on making lots of money, getting strong, and using, but not investing the opposite sex. It's a kind of very atomistic message now from parts of the right. And then from the left, for a long time, we've been hearing that for women. And there's this classic Bloomberg article that came out recently that said that basically, marriage and motherhood are a bad deal for women financially, which of course is completely false on the marriage front. And then also there's been articles in the New York Times, for instance, saying that married motherhood in America is a game that no one wins, right? And so it's telling women that they should kind of be steering clear from marriage. So kind of pretty mainstream institutions and now some online figures who are kind of advancing an atomistic, often career-focused, message that's telling folks that the path to prosperity and the path to happiness runs away from the family and not towards it. And what my book shows in part is that, in fact, that's completely false. Folks who are stably married are much better off financially. And then when it comes to happiness, no group of Americans are happier than married fathers and married mothers. And that latter point especially is often kind of either glossed over or even attacked in a lot of media and social media commentary.
Is it just because it's so easy to be selfish and it feels good at times, particularly in your early 20s, to be selfish? You think, well, this is what good feels like because I'm doing things for me, and it's so easy. I'm reminded of the quote from Jerry Seinfeld, although I'm sure he probably got it from somewhere else, where he says, God doesn't let you know the joy of having children until you have them. And so that's part of the issue, right? Is that people don't really know that once they get past, through the looking glass, so to speak, and start having children and getting married and kind of the joys that are on the other side of that, it's hard for them to understand the benefits of it because they need to sort of take that risk in order to understand it truly.
Yeah, I think obviously having kids is incredibly difficult. I mean, lost sleep, moody teenagers, the whole nine yards. I think people looking kind of from the outside, in on parents, in their own world or just, in the culture more generally, they can see all the difficulties of being a parent, but they just don't have that sense of how much meaning and direction and love one experiences as a father and mother. And so I think, it's sort of like, or starting up a new fitness routine. It's incredibly difficult at the beginning to get going on some kind of fitness routine. It's a lot of, sweat and suffering and pain. But obviously we all know the payoffs are major. I think it's the same thing when it comes, especially to parenthood. There's a lot of suffering on the front end, but the payoff for most of us, most of the time, is huge.
Let me ask you a question, because I think that there's some misconceptions about some of the framing of the arguments, not necessarily those made by your book, but kind of where it interplays with some of the other arguments that have been recently introduced on the right. For example, what was it, probably about 4-5 months ago, we had David Bahnsen, obviously broadly aligned on many issues with the three of us, in that chair. And now he has a new book about work. And his argument about work is about not only its divine inspiration, but also its centrality to a life well lived that includes that. And so how would your book interact with that, being so that we all are largely broadly aligned on that?
So I think on the work point, that's an important kind of, in some ways orthogonal point. So I think that the challenge here is to recognize and to appreciate that, particularly for men, I would say, although for women to some extent, for middle class, and especially upper middle class and upper class Americans, especially younger adults, I think things can be too focused on work. And there's plenty of Pew polling that I talk about in the book, and then just more generally that kind of just indicates, again, that young adults in that more kind of relatively privileged track are giving work a lot more kind of importance as a source of identity and direction and meaning than they are love and marriage, okay? But when we move down the sort of economic ladder, and we've been hearing this obviously since Charles Murray, what we're seeing is oftentimes a detachment from work, especially full-time work, that's particularly worrisome among less educated men. And that is one, I think, big reason why they are not getting married in the first place, and then two, why they're more likely to end up divorced in the second place. Because again, still today, it's the case that women are looking for guys who are reliable breadwinners, and if their boyfriend is not, they're more likely to steer clear of marriage. And then if they get married to him and he's not stably employed, way more likely to get divorced.
I think that given that layout there, I think having been hearing both these arguments and being familiar with both your books, I think if one thing, they're actually very, very complementary of each other, where one tackles more of the work aspect, one tackles more of the family aspect. And I think you both would agree that a successful marriage of the two ideas in that regard is I
see what you did there.
Thank you.
That's good.
Wasn't as bad as your joke yesterday.
Wait till we talk about proposals later.
You had something stocked up for that, didn't you? Yeah.
Did I use it too soon?
I think we probably went a little early on that. Regardless, but I think that they integrate well into a holistic understanding of basically, the trappings of Homo economicus in that way.
Enough about the good doom and gloom. We do love doom and gloom. I want to get into some of the positive side of what you say, is that you highlight various groups that are doing well.
Yes.
And you call them the strivers, the faithful, Asian Americans, and conservatives are the four groups. Without going too deep into each one, is there something that sort of links those groups in particular? And I don't want to give away the book. Again, go buy the book and read it. Yeah. But is there something that links those groups that is a commonality that helps them get have productive marriages?
Well, Brian, I think anyone who's kind of in this space, in the academy or in the media or even kind of smart lay audience knows the class story about marriage in America. I mean, kind of everyone knows that upper middle class Americans today way more likely to get married, stay married compared to working class and poor Americans. Okay, so that's part of the book story. But what people often don't know is there's a cultural story here playing out as well. And again, Asian Americans, the faithful religious Americans, and conservative Americans are markedly more likely to be married in the first place, and either happily married or stably married in the second place. And that's sort of part of the newer, portion of the story. And on the cultural side, what I would say is that for those three groups, Asian Americans, conservative Americans, and religious Americans, in different ways, they're more likely to appreciate the importance of commitment. That you have at some point you've got to put all your choices aside and commit on one person.
That's it, yeah.
And they, for instance, on this whole polyamory thing, which is now kind of in the news, but one expression of people having like this inability to understand how much commitment matters. Conservatives and religious folks way more likely to reject that, obviously, newer idea. And then when it comes to a community, I think too, for Asian Americans and religious Americans especially, you are your friends. You are your friends, right? And so if you have friends who are like reasonably good husbands and wives, reasonably good fathers and mothers, just trying to do their best by their families, your odds of doing the same way higher. If you don't have friends like that, your odds of succeeding at marriage are way lower. And so I think Asian Americans and religious Americans are more likely to be networks of folks, either kin or friends, who kind of are more likely to lead what I call a family-first lifestyle that's conducive to stronger
So if you're having
marriages.
struggles in your marriage, you look around and everybody tells you, hey, that happens, but there's a there's a pathway out of that, and let me help you, and you have support. So
Let me ask you, but really quickly, before we move on, kind of the taxonomy that you put out here, which way would we say in academia is the causal arrow going on that? For example, are these people those who have these innate traits to begin with, and they find themselves more suitable for marriage, or do they do they get married and then start developing these traits?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think on the whole, like, where does religion come from? Where does being more conservative come from? Is it is there a genetic story there? There's certainly some evidence that it's partly genetic, So I think we have to acknowledge that there are what we would call, again, selection effects in the academy. But I think there's also kind of institutional context too, where, as I said today, I mean, what's striking, for instance, to take the conservative versus liberal, piece, what we're seeing now is this huge and growing divide when it comes to attitudes towards fidelity, the importance of fidelity in marriage. So the selection effect doesn't kind of really explain the fact that back in 2010, there was really no big difference between liberals and conservatives when it comes to their attitudes about fidelity. But in the last 14 years, we've sort of seen kind of like this push for polyamory emerging in our culture. And conservatives have been a lot more likely, because of kind of the, they listen to shows like this or whatever. They read certain, things online. They might go to church more often. And kind of these cultural influences are kind of like protecting them from kind of, thinking the polyamory idea would be a good one for them.
Yeah.
So there's kind of an institutional context, Derek, that is different for liberals and conservatives in terms of like the kinds of podcasts and social networks and institutions they're plugged into. And I think it tends to be kind of protective for their marriages and their orientation towards family life in ways that I would say, unfortunately, progressives often don't have today.
And I'm super, as a comms guy who does a lot of polling and focus grouping and stuff like that, I'm super jealous that like you at arm's length get a focus group of like 18 to 22-year-olds all the time. It's got to be fascinating to be able to like reach into that to, talk. I mean, if you think about the future of marriage or relationships or just the future in general, whatever issue, you've got the future generation right there, outside your door every day. Is that, I mean, how do you utilize that? Because that seems like an incredible advantage for particularly the work that you do.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I mean, I think one of the things that, a lot of academics, and journalists, and myself included, kind of had this sort of implicit expectation that things were kind of just going to get worse and worse and worse on the marriage and family fronts, and that we're going to, just kind of become less what I would call familistic in our orientation towards life. And although there's certainly that dynamic playing out at UVA among a decent share of young adults, I'm also seeing kind of like this growing counterculture of UVA students who are very intentional about dating, and they're very interested kind of in both their faith and in marriage and family as well. And so we're seeing at my church, for instance, many more young marriages happening in the last couple of years than we saw when I first arrived in Charlottesville 20 years ago. So I'm not saying this is like a majority thing by any stretch. It's not, but there's certainly a larger and larger counterculture that I'm seeing unfold at UVA among, young women and young men who are kind of recognizing that what's been going on in a lot of families and the culture more generally isn't really working for folks. And they're looking to sort of forge a new path that's much more family friendly and also kind of more aggressively countercultural than anything that I've seen before among UVA students.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. On that same front, tech policy is one that we are getting into here at TBPF. I'm curious to know how like social media and the dating apps and all of that. I mean, it seemed interesting at first and a convenient way to do it, but maybe the counterculture is even potentially protesting against that whole culture of dating apps and all of that. Have you seen any effect of that?
So I think on kind of like the impact of technology on young adult relationships more generally, are a couple of things that are worth mentioning. Obviously, one is just that people's social skills have been severely degraded by smartphones, and that's obviously been a hindrance. We've seen dating come down in Gene Twenge's work at San Diego State, so that's part of the story. We've also, of course, seen too that social media is making young women more anxious and depressed, which I'm sure is not good for for dating either. Also, of course, pushing them to the left. The algorithms are pushing young women to the left and young men a little bit to the right. So I think there's a way in which social media is kind of contributing to an ideological polarization that makes dating more difficult for young adults. And then I think the other piece, obviously, is that for teenage boys and young men, I mean, a lot of these gaming platforms are, also kind of degrading both their social skills and kind of their capacity to have meaningful hobbies and grow meaningful skills and flourish in high school or in a trade school later or in college later in ways that would be good for them both personally and professionally, and also as potential kind of their dating or their mating value or their marital appeal, right? So I think at least we've been in the phase now for more than a decade of where technology has been a detriment to, I would say, dating, mating, marriage, and family information. But I think we may be seeing some, obviously here in Texas and elsewhere, efforts both to kind of keep big tech more under control for kids, but then try to figure out ways to harness it in a more family-friendly direction. So there's one, for instance, social dating app called Keeper, which is like the opposite of Tinder. It's designed to kind of put folks together who are interested in either marriage or kind of a serious relationship. And it's
Force for good.
It's very kind of deliberate about, having a much more kind of pro-marriage agenda than you would get on some dating
And
apps.
there's always been like ChristianDate.com
Sure.
and those kinds
Yep.
of things. It is kind of funny. I mean, we laugh about being the old guys, but I mean, we're around the same age, and I mean, the path from when I grew up, when we had, when I was in elementary schools, we had rotary phones, and then we had, VHS tapes.
Don't throw me in with the rotary phone
Yeah,
crowd.
I'm
now.
just saying, I remember those. I mean, again, we didn't, we had touched them pretty far after that. But the point is, it progressed slowly. Like the technology progressed slowly over time. And I look at now, and if you're 18 years old, I mean, what's just 18 years ago, it seems prehistoric to what they have now. I mean, do you think that that's having some effect just culturally in general, but then on this issue as well?
Well, I think that we're getting close to stepping on a landmine, and obviously, making direct linear projections from here, and catastrophizing, something we don't necessarily want to do on this podcast. But one problem I think that we can see on the horizon, and I think that anybody with a reasonable amount of critical thought can understand how it would get here. In fact, they've even made movies about this, is essentially the role of AI as it gets better and better and better, actually starting to fill that, to start function as a proxy for the social relationships. Now, obviously, it starts with, the chatbots that are, friendly, so to speak, or at least come across with that particular tone. But then, how do we know it doesn't end up in the movie Her? That's, that'd be one where...
AI.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's already probably more, I would say, more lascivious applications of that out there, as you could talk to any of our tech people, and they'll give you all the horror stories of that. So I'm not saying that we need to regulate AI into oblivion, but it's like that is a very, very, very big ravine that I can see us heading for, and I'm not necessarily sure what we can do to stop that. I don't know if Brad has any ideas in that realm.
Well, my colleague Michael Toscano at the Institute for Family Studies has been kind of focusing more on sort of what's the next generation of technology challenges facing families. And so we'll have kind of more from him later. But we have, I think you have as well here at TPPF, been focusing on kind of, both social media, pornography, and kinds of these other threats to our kids. But as you were saying, I think, AI is going to bring newer challenges. And we're already seeing in China, for instance, there was a story recently talking about how kind of young adults in China who are less socially adept are kind of often gravitating towards, social media or these AI-generated, platforms that kind of become their friends. And so I think going forward, we can imagine
the old pet rock.
Yeah, but way more engaging, right? And so I think there's going to be kind of a way that's all stratified, right? So the people who are more socially adept, who have decent friendships, married, whatever, probably less likely to succumb to an AI, companion. And I think folks who are more awkward, more likely to be an introvert, whatever it might be, are probably more likely to succumb to these, So that's going to be a real challenge.
In fact, I saw an advertisement. One of our tech folks shared it with an actual. I think it's like a medallion or something, but it's one that you actually talk to, and it texts you based on what it is hearing in your environment when it's listening. And I saw that, and I'm like, I don't watch Black Mirror because I think a lot of that stuff's a little too far-fetched. And then I see this ad, I'm like, oh, dear.
It's not. It is definitely not. Well, back to the book real quick. Again, as a comms guy, I love a good myth versus fact. And you do a really good job of dispelling some of the myths that are out there. You call them the flying solo myth, the family diversity myth, and the soulmate myth. We don't have to go through each one of those. I think, again, go read the book. But is there one of those that you think is more pervasive than others, that maybe if there's younger folks who are kind of being sucked into this right now that might be listening, is there one that you definitely want to make sure that people understand is things aren't as they seem?
So I would just quickly say the flying solo myth and the soulmate myth are different myths that I think are relevant for young adults today. So the flying solo myth obviously is this idea that like the path to happiness, living your best life, is just kind of being single for, at least for your 20s is kind of the thought here. And yet we know that 20-somethings, of course 30-somethings as well, who are married are just much more likely to be flourishing, happier and all that kind of stuff. So that's one myth that I try to dispatch in the book. And then the soulmate myth.
And it's just not true because the data shows it's not true. Is that right?
But I think the point I make too is that Aristotle said that we are social animals. Again, we're social animals. I think for most of us, our friendships and our dating and marital relationships, and then as parents, these things become so important to us. And to kind of think that just sort of doing our own thing on our own terms, most of the time is going to make us happy or give our lives a sense of meaning and direction and purpose this is kind of one of those contemporary myths. It's not true. We actually derive meaning from living for others, not for ourselves.
Try living in the woods, see how long you last.
Yeah, so that's one. And the other thing is the soulmate myth. And I think it's kind of this idea, and it's articulated both in the book and the movie Eat, Pray, Love. Liz Gilbert's kind of she's like the epitome of this. But she kind of has this idea in her book, for instance, that kind of, love is about kind of this intense, romantic, emotional connection between two people. It's this kind of magical thing that's going to make you happy all the time. And there's like kind of no consideration of like kids and this, understanding of love, no consideration of broader kinship networks, no thought of money even, it's just kind of like, it's about emotions and about romance and this kind of, this intense connection. And I don't want to minimize like the importance of romance. It's obviously important. It's often huge at the beginning of a relationship. I just want to kind of tell people, look, there's a lot more to love than this intense, feeling you have often at the beginning of a relationship, and understanding that kind of a thicker and richer understanding of love that sees love as about, yes, romance, but also about serving the good of the other person in the relationship, establishing a financial foundation that's good for you and your spouse, recognizing that when kids are in the picture, they need you guys, if at all possible, to stay together. That this sort of thicker, more family-first understanding of love is not surprisingly more stable than the soulmate model, because feelings are kind of a fragile foundation for a marriage. But it's also, I think this is the surprise, because she's, Liz Gilbert, for instance, is constantly talking about happiness in her book. But it's also the case that Americans who embrace this sort of thicker understanding, this family-first understanding of love, are actually happier in their marriages. I think that's the case in part because they're not kind of just focused on the ebb and flow of their feelings. They're kind of understanding and appreciating at some level that their marriage is about a lot more than just the two of them.
That's exactly right. So this is the right idea. We like to talk about the ideas, with the policy behind it. We don't have to go, you have 5 recommendations in the book. Our new research paper, I think, has 4 recommendations. The one that they combine on is the success sequence. I mean, you mentioned that in your book. This is one that we talk about, potentially teaching the success sequence very early in school so people understand what it is, and it basically guarantees you prosperity. I don't want to go that far, maybe Derek, on that. But if you look at the statistics, it does. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Right. So the success sequence is this idea. It's been around for a while, including from some Brookings scholars named Ron Haskins and Bell Sawhill, that basically education, work, and marriage are the 3 pillars of succeeding in the American dream. And if you get at least a high school degree, you work full time in your 20s, and you get married before having children, you do those 3 things, your odds of being poor, Brian, are just 3%, and your odds of being in the middle class or higher are 86%. And this applies to young adults from lower income backgrounds. It applies to Black and Hispanic young adults. So in those 3 groups, for instance, more than 90% of the folks who follow those 3 steps are not going to be poor in their late 20s and in their 30s. So it's just kind of a way, I think, of trying to educate, inform, and motivate our young adults to appreciate how much their education matters, how much working full-time, in their 20s matters, and then how much putting a ring on it before they have children matters. And we do see that there are these clear financial advantages. And then actually just yesterday, my colleague Dr. Wendy Wang at the Institute for Family Studies and Sam Wilkinson at Yale published a new report on the emotional and family side of the success sequence. And they find that young adults who are following the sequence are about 50% less likely to be distressed emotionally. They got this scale for different emotions. And then also young adults who are kind of following the sequence are markedly more likely to be in stable married families, in their 30s than their peers who are not following the sequence.
Not a lot of guarantees in life, especially if you're a confused 16-year-old or 17.
Sure.
I can only imagine someone, being able to teach this and say, look, again, not a lot of guarantees in life, but if you follow this path, you're going to make it out, make it out pretty clean. So let's talk about legislation here in Texas. Derek, I mean, the prospects for something like, I guess mandate, everybody hates that word, but, this is a success sequence in schools, auditing government programs that could disincentivize marriage. We've talked about a commission to study what's happening, to men and boys in this state. And then, of course, home affordability, one of the biggest decisions that a married couple will make. So those are all policy ideas. What do you think the prospects are for getting that sort of family first agenda going in the next legislation?
My prognosis would be that it's pretty likely, so long as the case is fully made. Because if you look at the activity in the field, specifically the work, not everyone needs to go to college, but doesn't mean everyone needs some form of advanced post-high school education. I think that battle's been relatively decided here in the state of Texas, and we see both last session and some of the work in the interim, an incremental working in those particular directions. With some of the tax issues, that's a little more complicated. Obviously, a lot of people, and again, we have to caution that the economy and raising a family, and again, Homo economicus is not just a simple if we just had the right technocrat turning the right knobs, that'd be a thing.
Yep.
But that being said, and then also we also don't have the biggest tool used for social programming via public finance, which is the income tax. Long may it stay away. But there are preferences that we've seen, specifically with the last round of property tax reform, where they actually are looking at certain determinants, and whether or not you're over 65, whether or not you have veteran status. So this would be something that would belong squarely in that particular discussion. School choice, I think, I know it's our obligation, but I think we've already established where we're at on that and how it could actually benefit somebody if they have a better K-12 experience with their schooling. That makes it more attractive for post-secondary if that's the way they want to go, for college if that's the right option, or even better to get a running head start into that vocational program. And then obviously when it comes to actually teaching the success sequence in public schools, that might be the lightest lift of all. And of course, I don't want to jinx it, of course, but when it comes to adding additional parts of either an optional or a small part of the required curriculum, whether it's in the TEKS or not, that tends to be, I think something like that will be more valuable than a lot of folks are seeing with kind of the current program offerings.
Brad, I don't think the federal government can legislate post office names. I don't think they're able to even do that at this point. So I'm going to go. Have there been states? I mean, is Virginia or other states, taking your advice? Have they looked at family friendly agendas? And is there any state that you would put as a model for like maybe Texas to take a look at?
So Utah, not surprisingly, has been kind of leading out on the family policy front, and they've done a couple of things in recent years. One of which is to try to think about ways to get the success sequence in more schools across Utah. They've also, I think, been considering another measure we talk about in this new report with TPPF, and that is kind of looking at how state agencies, how their outcomes are kind of distributed by family structure, especially in the education world. So that's kind of under consideration, I think, in Utah as well. And then also Governor Cox in Utah has been involved too in efforts to try to figure out ways to get more affordable single-family homes built in Utah. Of course, their big problems is so much of their land in Utah is actually controlled or owned by the federal government. They actually don't have enough kind of room to grow there in Utah. So that's kind of
big lawsuit going on there right now.
It's kind of debating like who the best golfer is. It's like Scotty Scheffler, and then we'll talk about the rest. Is there anybody? So Utah's kind of unfair,
Utah has kind of done a couple of things, and they're trying to do more things as well, which is great. But Oklahoma, just to your north, has done work
okay, we
around.
Can stop there. Just kidding. There's a bit of a rivalry.
Has done some work over the years on marriage, and it's not been like world changing, but there's been some evidence that's been successful. in Oklahoma as well. And then there are a bunch of states, including your state, that have been also, I think, understanding and appreciating that big tech now poses a big, challenge and threat to our kids and our families, our family life. And so kind of, I think all the measures that have rolled out related to pornography and related to social media also have kind of indirect effect on families as well.
Well, this has been awesome. We're about to. I'm getting the whistle from our producer telling us we need to get into the 10-minute drill. So we're going to have you stick around for that. But this has been a fantastic discussion. Again, everybody go buy the book. Brad, thanks for being here with us.
Thanks, Brian.
All right, so stick around. We're going to get into our 10-minute drill. Our first segment we always like to talk about is polling, because our audience just loves polls and all the insiders.
And you get to make the agenda.
Yeah, and that's true. And I love polls, so that's part of it. One of the interesting statistic that I saw some analysis from Scott Rasmussen on the last debate, and this is sort of an interesting kind of opens up this question of like, are debates even needed anymore? Of course, Trump is saying he's not going to do the next debate, and Kamala's out there challenging him. But his statistic was only 1% of debate viewers were uncommitted to either candidate, and so you have essentially 99% of everybody who already knows who they're going to vote for and is committed to that candidate sitting there watching a debate pretending like it matters what the other person is going to say. Derek, 1% of people are willing to change their mind watching the debate. Are we past the point of needing these debate contests?
If you look at the purpose of debate and the way it actually went, the 1%, it actually kind of surprises me that it was that high, to be honest with you, because if you look at what the debate is, it's my guy or gal versus your guy or gal, and so you're already fundamentally plugged in. There's very few folks, I guess, in this age of drinking from a political fire hose where politics have infested every single area of our life, where you can't say, if you have a opinion on, say, Taylor Swift, that obviously has an adjunct political connotation to it. The problem, of course, being that this 1% doesn't capture the actual people that vote out of a sense of civic responsibility, that still are polling in ways where they if you look at the enthusiasm gap between, now obviously there's a lot worse with Biden on the ticket than it was with Harris on the ticket, but if you look at the just general enthusiasm and net unfavorables of both candidates, it turns out to be one of these things where it's like, again, I'm surprised that number was that high. I can tell you for a fact, because the debate was on a Tuesday, several of us that work here went to bike night at COTA, ride your bicycles around the Circuit of the Americas, rather than watch it, because we know that we were just going to have it shotgunned at us, the next day anyway, and there wasn't going to be, whether or not one candidate performed better than the other. We're not civilians in this space, and I would argue that of the 99% that responded to Scott's poll, I would say that they're probably not civilians in that space either.
Yeah, and he does mention that, Brad, Virginia is right there next to D.C. You can't escape politics. Everything's political, and of course you have the great Larry Sabato at your university. But you talked about the political polarization that may be affecting marriages and families. Do you think it gets worse before it gets better?
Yeah, I think it gets worse before it gets better. Yeah, and I do think one thing in terms of my own work is we are seeing that even family kind of forms are polarized now. So that married folks are more likely to be leaning Republican, and single folks are more likely to be leaning in the Democratic direction. So there are just so many axes now that are lining up in terms of education, family, religion, that kind of tend to reinforce a lot of these divides in our public life.
That's one of the reasons why I was shocked at that number, that we've declined in Texas. We've declined in marriages by 45%, because one of the quote-unquote special interest groups that conservatives have rallied behind the last 5 years has been parents. I mean, especially after the pandemic and seeing what was going on in schools, parents have become a real force. But in Texas, if marriages are declining and people are having less kids.
But I want to make two counter sort of countervailing kind of points here. It's true that the marriage rates come down in Texas in recent years, as you were mentioning, since 1990, among other times. But we're also seeing, too, that your fertility rate's still relatively higher in Texas than it is across America. So that's, Texans are having...
Even though it's below the 2.1
Yeah, it's below replacement, but it's still relatively better than where it is in the rest of the country. And when it comes to kind of what is the state that's the number one destination for families who are moving with kids, it's Texas, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's also the case, I think, that Texas is not doing maybe as well as it was, 30 years ago when it comes to family, but it's doing relatively better in some important metrics than other places around the country.
James Quintero is doing his part.
Inside joke. All right, so the second segment of our 10-minute drill, lies, damn lies, and statistics. We talk about reports that come out. I saw a new report that companies are firing Gen Z workers just months after hiring them fresh from college. So this kind of goes into what we talked about the skills and the social skills and all of that. 60% of employees have already fired some college graduates that they had recruited earlier in the year. 1 in 7 employers said they might not hire college graduates as a result. Business leaders listed concerns in areas such as communication skills, we talked about, professionalism. They also said that the workers of that age are often unmotivated and they need to be constantly told what to do rather than use their initiative. I mean, you have a focus group every day of young people. Does that ring a bell?
I mean, for a minority, maybe, yeah. I think, the other kind of challenge that we're seeing now is just the rise of AI, to your point about AI earlier. And I've got a colleague who's in marketing, and he says now, like, what they've begun to do, because a lot of people would have things on their resumes that were not congruent with their actual skills. And so, and he thinks that kind of AI has made it easier for folks in college right now to kind of like get by without actually truly developing the skills they need to flourish in the marketplace. Yeah. And so what they're doing now with people that they're interviewing is they'll kind of put them in a room without access to their phone or anything else, and with their own computer, the company's computer, and have them go through an array of Excel, whatever's on their resume to kind of really test to see if they know this stuff.
That's funny.
And if they do, great, they've got a job, but a lot of the folks that they are testing don't necessarily.
Well, we haven't fired any of the Gen Z folks that we've hired recently, Derek. No, you had to think about it?
No, I did have to think about it.
Not to say that they didn't, demonstrate any of these issues. We just haven't fired them yet.
Yeah, but I mean, to your point though, and I definitely wouldn't paint Mr. Jefferson's college with this. But if you look at college generally, and we've talked about the value of the bachelor credential, ad nauseum on this program. Right? What are you learning in college that's of any value to a private employer? Again, we can separate the entire, all the woke stuff, all the protesting, all the things that were kind of percolates to the top. But the actual value of the credential, whether it's through grade inflation, whether it's through kind of the unmooring of the philosophical understanding of what higher education is supposed to be, the value of that credential has been plummeting. Now, of course, I would say, in contra to the responses here, I wouldn't say, therefore you shouldn't hire college graduates, because, I'm not saying, okay, now that credential's, next to worthless, just completely eschewing it at all is bad too, because that's a categorical error in the other direction. Mm-hmm. But what I would say is, to Brad's point, is we need to be looking at things that aren't, that don't have like a piece of paper with Latin on it, and that being the determinant of your employability. Mm-hmm. Now, for each industry, there's going to be different, I would say, different characteristics you're looking for and evaluating, but clearly what the boilerplate takeaways from college aren't getting the job done.
All right, so for our last segment, we like to look ahead to see what's coming up in the next couple of weeks to kind of preview that. For me, voting has already started. I'm a big political nerd. I like, reading the dailies. I mean, it's almost like reading polling every day. But voting has already started in several states, not yet in Texas. But it'll be interesting to see kind of where the campaigns go from here, because that's one of the problems with early voting, of course, is that a lot of people are making their decision right now, and there's no way to take it back just in case, if something happens, sure. To Trump's point, right. What's the point of doing a debate when you've got all these millions of people who are already making their choice? Mm-hmm. There's nothing I can say that's going to pull that back in case they didn't vote for me. So I'm looking for that. So I'm going to be reading the daily tea leaves on that, and still kind of just watching to see if there'll be a debate. Derek, anything going on the next couple of weeks or month that you're going to be keeping an eye on?
I'd like to see this this dance that the White House / Biden-Harris administration / Harris candidacy is going to do, when we basically have a candidate that's out there, making the rounds. I'm not sure who's running the country right now, and this is not. I don't mean this in the right-wing fever swamp kind of way, but I mean if you looked at if you watched President Biden's discuss both his cabinet meetings, and again this is not a Jill Biden's running cabinet meetings thing, but if you look at his conduct during the cabinet meetings, his speech before the UN, these are major seminal pieces of a presidency. These are something where if you need a steady hand on the wheel, it needs to be in the internal function of your own administration, and it needs to be how you represent the American people and your vision as the titular head of the American people to the world. And obviously both of those were, in my assessment, catastrophic failures. So which leads me to the question, if the vice president, the next in line for the I was going to say success sequence, but the succession sequence,
the unsuccess sequence,
is out campaigning, who is actually seeing to the day-to-day maintenance of the country? And then this is where I think it gets into a lot more of the problematic issues that are active in the farther areas of the right. And this is going to where we see the administrative state out of control, because again, they're basically operating not only with impunity, but there's no checks on them.
Turns out it's Pete Buttigieg, which is terrifying.
Yeah, I was going to say, as somebody who's originally from Ohio, that's terrifying.
Brad, what about you? What's coming up for you? Anything else you need to promote? Have you started your next book, or any other? You just still continue to tour the country and pitch the marriage thing, or what's up for you? What's coming up for you?
Yeah, no, just working on getting this Texas report out, to the community here in Texas, and we're going to do some similar work in Ohio and then also Virginia as well. So looking more kind of the state-based context and kind of what can we do in Virginia and then also in Ohio to make those two states more family-friendly as well.
Excellent. Well, we will keep an eye on that. All right. So to all of you, thank you, Brad, so much for being here and being with us today and being part of this whole effort and of course the paper that we put out. Again, for the last time, go get the book. It's fantastic. Give it particularly to your non-married friends. I would definitely hand them the book this Christmas. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. We appreciate it. As always, if you want more information about what we're working on here at Texas Policy, our flagship newsletter goes out every week. It's called The Post. You can sign up at texaspolicy.com/The Post. It's kind of fun. It's got some interesting Texas stuff, but it's also got a lot of the important stuff that TPPF is working on a day-to-day basis. So thank you all for watching. Thank you all for listening. And as we like to say at the end of every show, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.